Today, I'm really honored to introduce Dzikamai Bere, who is a remarkable activist and scholar and human rights defender. He is currently the National Director of the Zimbabwean Human Rights Association, which is known as ZimRights. And that's the largest and the oldest grassroots human rights advocacy group in Zimbabwe. It's got over 250,000 members, so it's quite substantial. He has been part of the Secretariat of Zim Rights since January 2020, and he has been around for quite a few years. I've known him in the transitional justice sector. He's very well known as a mover in the transitional justice and peace building sphere. And so I'm very excited to have him speak to us about some of the challenges faced in Zimbabwe with dealing with Gukurahundi. Over to you, Dzikamai.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helen, for that introduction and for those kind words. How many minutes do I have? 10, 15?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you have 30 minutes, and I'll send you a message when there's 5 left.
That's fine. I will be sharing my screen. Yes. See if the technology allows me to do this. We tested it before and it worked. Just to check if everyone can see my screen now.
Yes, it's visible.
All right, that's fine. Yeah, so thanks very much. So I have been asked to share some reflections on Gukurahundi. So as Helen has indicated, I work with an organization called the Zimbabwe Human Rights Association. And in the Zimbabwe Human Rights Association, we run a program called the Right to Peace campaign, which is located within one of our action zones. It's called the Right to Peace Action Zone. And every year we produce the State of Peace report, and our last State of Peace report, which you can see there in that calabash there, is called the Broken Calabash. I thought it's relevant to recall this because when we launched the State of Peace report on the International Day of Peace last year, the community did have a conversation around Gukurahundi, and some of the reflections from that conversation have influenced what I'm going to be sharing with you today. But briefly, like what Helen mentioned, I'm a human rights activist. But before I'm an activist, I am a child, a daughter in a family of 8. I'm a husband to 1 woman and a father to 2 kids and an activist at heart. Now I'll speak briefly about the organization that I represent, which is the Zimbabwe Human Rights Association. Helen mentioned that this is a grassroots movement that brings together about 250,000 activists across the country. And our vision is to see a Zimbabwean society in which communities actively lead in creating and sustaining a culture of human rights. And you will see how it plays out in some of the work that we have been involved in transitional justice. Our values, top of them is activism. So we are activists. We have no apologies about that. But we are a community, as Helen mentioned. We are the biggest human rights community in Zimbabwe, bringing together 250,000 members. We believe strongly in integrity because it gives us the credibility to demand more from our leaders. And at Zim Rights, we run with a strategy that we currently call the Shifting Power to the People strategy. It's got 5 strategic priorities. And the conversation we are having today sits within the building a critical mass pillar of our strategic priorities. The goal being we believe that if we bring a lot of people together to fight injustice, we will be able to achieve more. And in Zimbabwe, one of those issues that we have been dealing with is Gukurahundi. So I will share some bit of background Sometime last year, in 2023, I had the privilege of attending the Shift the Power Summit in Bogota. And at one of the opening ceremonies, a commissioner from the Columbia Truth Commission said something that I found very touching. She said, peace does not come to us. Peace is a change in the way we live and relate with each other. So I thought I could ground that for our conversation. I found that to be very, it breaks down sometimes things that may look complicated. So just to give you the background and context for Zimbabwe, for those who may not be familiar. So Zimbabwe is located in southern Rhodesia. You can see on my screen, that's the map of Zimbabwe. Call ourselves the teapot country because we actually shaped like a teapot there. As a teapot, when you put it on fire, things boil in there, and we are currently sitting on fire and we can feel the heat because of violence and conflict. And one of the worst conflicts that Zimbabwe has gone through is the liberation war that was fought between 1964 and 1979. That's the war that ultimately led to the Longest House Conference, which then led to the Longest House Peace Agreement and led to Zimbabwe gaining political independence in 1980, but at the cost of more than 50,000 lives, people who died during the war. And the first leader of independent Zimbabwe was Robert Mugabe, who was quite an international figure because of the role that he played in leading independent Zimbabwe. And Mugabe he became very popular for his policy of reconciliation. So he participated in a guerrilla war of independence, of liberation, and over 50,000 people died. And at independence, he gave this big speech in which he said the sins of the past stand forgiven and forgotten. And for those words, he became a global hero. People believed in what he was doing. Now, what was wrong with that? What was wrong with that was that it was rhetoric. He had consulted no one. There was no written policy. There was no transitional justice. There was no interaction with the victims of the war. There was no plan on how to address that. And now we know that it was all just rhetoric because 2 years into his rule, 1982, Mugabe unleashed violence on a civilian population. So there was an insurgence in the Matabeleland areas, the southern region that you can see on the map there. That's the red area. And Mugabe deployed the military to combat the insurgents there. And the operation ran from 1982 to 1987. So that is the operation that was known as Gukurahundi. I was speaking with Kaya earlier on, and she was saying she would want to know what Gukurahundi means. So Gukurahundi is a Shona word that stands for early rains that wash away the chaff after a harvest season. Culturally in Zimbabwe, as seasons shift, the rains that we receive, they've got names. So after a harvest, people are, clearing the granaries and everything. So there are rains that come just after that harvest. And traditionally, those rains are believed that their role is to clean the earth because they wash away all the dirt that remains after a harvest process. So Mugabe called that military operation Gukurahundi. What he meant was that the harvest was the harvest of independence. But the people who were opposing his rule, mainly the ZAPU political party from Matabeleland, were like the dirt that needed to be cleaned and washed away. So that's where the name Gukurahundi comes from. And now it's funny that today, this is part of the conversations around the spirituality of language and violence. Today, many people don't know Gukurahundi in relationship to its cultural significance of rain, life-giving rain that cleans and nourishes the earth. They know Gukurahundi is associated with bloodbath, atrocity. So you mention the name Gukurahundi to any Zimbabwean, they don't know about the rain. they know about bloodbath in Matabeleland. So that's the name Gukurahundi there. So between 1982, Mugabe unleashed the military, and the operation was led by the army. It was led by the 5th Brigade. You know, there are different groups of the Zimbabwe National Army, and the group that led that operation was known at that time as the 5th Brigade, trained in North Korea. And they unleashed serious atrocities around on civilians. Now, there have been attempts, I will come to speak about those atrocities. There have been attempts to address Gukurahundi. So I will highlight some of the key developments following this atrocity. 1987, which marked the official end of the operation, a unit accord was signed between Robert Mugabe, the then president of Zimbabwe, and Joshua Nkomo, who was the leader of the ZAPU, which was the opposition political party that was being accused of insurgents in the southern region. Joshua Nkomo is a major political figure in Zimbabwe. He's actually known as the father of Zimbabwe. If you wanted to know his stature, Joshua Nkomo would be what Mandela is to South Africa. That's what Joshua Nkomo is to Zimbabwe. The respected figure who was a moral authority for the nationalist movement, one of the few political leaders who could be associated with inspiring ethical leadership. So he's the one who was the founder of Zimbabwe's nationalist movement. And there were problems, more to do with tribalism, in which some of his comrades, mainly the Shona part, who included Mugabe and others, did not believe that someone from a minority tribe should lead independence. So those problems, the roots of those problems, still during the Liberation War, are the ones that then reared their ugly head post-independence, because Mugabe still believed that he did not have total control until he puts down the opposition from ZAPU and he puts down Joshua Nkomo. So these were the two main figures when we speak about Gukurahundi. So the Unit Accord of 1987 brought these two main figures together with their political parties. So ZANU, which was led by Mugabe, and ZAPU, which was led by Joshua Nkomo, came together to form ZANU-PF through the Unit Accord, so that put an end to the war, to the Gukurahundi atrocities. But before that, on 16 March 1983, there was a plea from the Catholic bishops who went to see Mugabe with a request to stop the Gukurahundi. This was after the Catholic Bishops' Conference in Zimbabwe had just released a pastoral letter that was known as Reconciliation is Still Possible. Now, because of the way Gukurahundi was unleashed on civilians, the Catholic Church played a very important role. It became a refuge for victims. So it played a very important role in terms of documenting the violations, so they could see the ugliness of the violence. Which is why when they produced the Reconciliation is Still Possible, they felt the urgency to approach the prime minister. He was a prime minister then. So they went to see Mugabe and to encourage him to stop the military. Mugabe insulted them. He said they were agents of the worst and that they were part of the NGOs that were meant to tarnish his government. But pressure continued to mount, such that in 1984, he was forced to appoint the Zimbabwe Committee of Inquiry, which was supposed to hear evidence on allegations of atrocities. So he still called them allegations. So the committee, which was chaired by lawyer Simplicius Chiambakwe, I think he is still alive. After hearing evidence, they collected evidence, but they produced a report. But up to today, we have never seen the report. I will share with you some of the efforts that have been done to try and address that issue. Then in 1987, the Legal Resources Foundation which is an incredible organization in Zimbabwe, which I think has not been credited enough for this work. So Legal Resources Foundation, working together with the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, they produced a report that is now known as Breaking the Silence, which detailed for the first time. So this was the first report with testimonies from over 2,000 interviews, which detailed the atrocities committed by the 5th Brigade in Matabeleland. So I'm going to share some of the findings that you find in that report so that you understand the magnitude of Gukurahundi. So there were many crimes that were committed during Gukurahundi. Mass killings. So between 1982 to 1987, over 20,000 civilians were killed in Midlands and Matabeleland provinces. So I want you to understand the magnitude of this. The War of Liberation killed about 50,000 people. Now, the black government that came after independence deployed the military to kill about 20,000 civilians. So this was a black government declaring war on its own people. So it was a major atrocity. Sexual terrorism was committed. We call it sexual terrorism because of the gravity. It was not just a rape. It was not just a violence. It was sexual terrorism. Over 60,000 women and girls were raped in the Midlands and Matabeleland areas. So rape was used as a weapon to punish civilians who were accused of supporting the opposition. It's a continuing atrocity because up to now, the children in Matabeleland and the Midlands regions who don't know who their fathers are. They are children of Gukurahundi, and you can imagine the trauma that carries. And many of them have no birth certificates. And when the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission recently carried out an inquiry into access to documentation, they realized that that atrocity still continues to live with the people of Matabeleland, where people have no access to documentation because they don't know who their father is. Torture. People were tortured in various ways, severe beatings, starvation, forced consumption, live burials. People would be buried alive. And forced disappearances. Thousands of victims disappeared. Some were kidnapped, thrown in mine shafts, buried in mass graves, and many of them up to today remain unaccounted for. Documenting the full extent of the atrocities committed during Gukurahundi would take a full day. I decided to take just a snapshot, but those who want to read more, the presentation will come with some of the links. And then what? So the Breaking the Silence started an era of an official dialogue about Zimbabwe's dark history of violence. The government continued to deny Gukurahundi. The closest they ever came to acknowledging Gukurahundi was when Mugabe said it was a moment of madness. He never told us who was mad. He never told us if that madness had been cured. In 2008, an incredible organization known as the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, it sued the government of Zimbabwe together with Legal Resources Foundation, forcing the government to release the Chambakwe report. So remember, I spoke about the Commission of Inquiry that was appointed in 1984, and the report was never seen. So in 2008, Lawyers for Human Rights tried to obtain that report. And the Minister of Justice said he does not know where the report is. Just imagine that. After using state resources, you do interviews, and people demand accountability. And he said he does not have the report. In August 2003, civil society in Zimbabwe convened what is now known as the Johannesburg Symposium, Civil Society and Justice in Zimbabwe. It was convened by an organization called Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, together with the Trauma Coalition. And among other things, they resolved to push for transitional justice. In 2008, for some who may have followed the politics in Zimbabwe, the opposition led by Morgan Tsvangirai won the elections in 2008, but Mugabe refused to give up power. So following pressure from the Southern Africa Development Community, Tsvangirai and Mugabe signed a global political agreement. But before that global political agreement was signed, it became clear that justice was going to be sacrificed for political expedience. So civil society met in Zimbabwe and agreed that whatever agreement that they would make, they had no right and no authority to grant amnesty to anyone and to sacrifice the justice for the victims. Now, then that started a series of civil society efforts of trying to address those atrocities, including Gukurahundi. And I'll just summarize some of them. So between 2008 and 2012, civil society ran a campaign that I was part of, the Taking Transitional Justice to the People, where we went into the communities. And the approach that we were using was saying, if the politicians know, the people can say yes. If the politicians say they don't want to deal with transitional justice, they don't want to address Gukurahundi, the people can force them to do so. So we ran that campaign from 2008 to 2012. And the major result of that campaign was that the 2013 new constitution of Zimbabwe now carried provisions that established the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. In 2008, as part of so that was 2018, I think there's a typo there. In 2018, the commission was operationalized. So for those who follow may remember that in 2017, there was a military coup in Zimbabwe that brought the current president. And then in 2018, they held elections. And one of the things that he did as soon as he went into office was to make sure that the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission was operational. And the commission then started its work. They came up with a plan, strategic plan, and they planned to hold Gukurahundi hearings. But the commission was sabotaged left, right, and center, resource starvation, all sorts of things. They were never able to do any meaningful work on Gukurahundi. Around the same year, 2018, civil society met in Bulawayo under the National Transitional Justice Working Group. I was the coordinator of the National Transitional Justice Working Group then, at a symposium, and made a number of recommendations. And one of those recommendations was that the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission was not the proper institution to address Gukurahundi. And we recommended the establishment of a credible Gukurahundi Commission led by Matebela and heavyweights. We have got the credibility, mainly people from civil society. Of course, seeing the progress that civil society was making in making these demands, that same year, in less than 2 months since we concluded the symposium in Bulawayo, the chiefs led by Chief Charumbira, the traditional leaders, they convened a meeting in Bulawayo to condemn civil society for trying to politicize Gukurahundi. And they started mobilizing traditional leaders to lead the process. So in 2018, the traditional leaders started working, or at least I think the political leaders started manipulating the traditional leaders for a hostile takeover of the Gukurahundi issue. In 2020, the Ministry of Justice, working with those selected traditional leaders, started a process of what they called addressing Gukurahundi, including public hearings and reburials. And on 14 July 2024, President Emmerson Mnangagwa officially launched the chief-led process of addressing Gukurahundi. Sadly, some civil society groups supported this process, while many others, some of us, still believe that the traditional leaders, which over the years have become aligned to the ruling party, can never lead a credible process. It's got nothing to do with the credibility of the traditional leaders themselves. There are many problems. One is that traditional leaders have documented their loyalty to ruling party ZANU-PF. And the ruling party ZANU-PF is the party that is accused of perpetrating Gukurahundi. So they cannot be impartial. They can have dialogues, conversations, but they cannot address Gukurahundi. These views are shared by many. I share those views. One of the leading authorities on transitional justice in Zimbabwe is a human rights lawyer and activist, Dr. Sipho Malonga. And he said, chiefs alone cannot resolve Gukurahundi because on the face of it, Gukurahundi is criminal in nature. So I share the link to the lecture that he delivered in which he spoke about this. I also did have a conversation with several stakeholders, and my view was that the current process is most likely to produce what I call pseudo-transitional justice, a fraud in short. And I also share the link to those conversations. Now, let me close with some reflections here. Some reflections coming from our experience of Gukurahundi. So number one is it never goes away. So Gukurahundi happened more than 4 decades ago. And yet it is still a fresh conversation, just like it happened yesterday. So my view is that unless addressed, it never goes away. Whatever the politicians are trying to do, it's a waste of time. Number two, civil society leadership. If politicians had their way, Gukurahundi would be forgotten. In fact, any atrocity in the world would be forgotten. So the reason why that subject is alive today is because of the work of civil society. So in the conversation, I've mentioned some organizations that worked very hard. So the point that I make is, as civil society, we must continue to provide leadership in the push for justice and peace. Now that's linked to the third point of reflection, which is political accountability. And over the years that I've worked on this and many other transitional justice issues, I have learned that political will is a fiction. Because politicians will never do what we want them to do, especially if it implicates them. So many times when we meet and we say there is no political will, like we expect political will, we're living in a political fiction. We must operate from the belief that politicians, and the history is on our side, have never willingly done what needs to be done. So our task is to build the muscle and the society's capacity to demand justice through political accountability. I think we need to let that sink, to know that this is a struggle. As I always say, that human rights work is a liberation struggle. Simply because we choose to do it without violence does not make it less important. Political accountability will not happen until we build the community's muscle and capacity to demand justice through political accountability. Number three, which links to the first quotation that I mentioned from the Columbia Truth Commission. And I find that those words by Eisenhower very, very helpful, where indeed I think that people want peace so much that one of these days governments had better get out of the way and let them have it. So this speaks to me about community leadership and all the work that we've been doing around Gukurahundi and other atrocities. It has become clear to us at Zimrights, and the Broken Calabash report, which is our latest state of peace report, makes it very clear that the people are tired of committees and commissions that have no commitment to justice. The first thing that those commissions do once they are appointed into power is to buy expensive vehicles. In Zimbabwe, we give them Range Rovers, and one Range Rover costs between $80,000 and $120,000. And people struggle to get to those commissions so that they get those packs. And they'll be driving into impoverished communities with those expensive vehicles. So in the 2024 State of Peace report, communities said, we are tired of those. We now want a community-led process because we understand what we went through. So there is no need for us to continue laboring on these expensive commissions, elite commissions. So the quest now is that there is no peace unless communities are able to lead the quest for peace. And our role as activists, as civil society, is to keep bringing as many people as possible in the process until we have a critical mass. So I want to close with this quotation that comes from Martin Jr. Luther King. So when we reflect on Gukurahundi and many other atrocities that we have faced in Zimbabwe, we see the abuse of power being deployed for the decimation of humanity. And I think it's a moment for us to reflect. What's the meaning of power? And how can we transform it? So these words, I think, are a good ending, that power without love is reckless and abusive. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. And power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. At its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So that's a message for us to those who find themselves with power, whether it's governmental power, whether it's community power, that when we look back at the atrocities that we have gone through, many of them represent the abuse of power. And I think transitional justice must seek to transform the use of that power so that the power is used to correct everything that stands against love. So that'll be it. Thank you very much.